lunchtime discussion of urban nervous systems. So everyone knows this is part of our spring festival, Arteries, NYC in Circulation, where we're looking at movement through the city and also interpretations of arteries from streetscapes to underground transportation networks, waterways. So far this week we've done a discussion on Gowanus Canal as an unclogging artery. We've done a Second Avenue subway, non-Second Avenue subway, look at Second Avenue other than subways, convention walking tour on the Lower East Side. And also we did a flash competition on last Saturday looking at the protest spaces. So we're in our final day of the festival now, and later this evening we'll be doing a double-decker bus tour of the gerrymandered arteries of Williamsburg State Senate District. It's led by 3 performance artists, which should be really fun night. We're here today. I'm excited to partner with McConnell and Black Gotham Experience. I think probably our 3rd official partnership, or 4th. And this is a brand new programming hub that I'll tell you more about. And so the genesis of this conversation was that McConnell was telling us about this new project he's doing that's involves like augmented reality information points. We'll elucidate that more too. And so we got to talking about how the shape of information points and newsstands and kiosks is changing so much in the city. And Ben Allen has worked in that typology as well. And then we started talking about like, oh, it would be cool to expand upon this and see how local culture and communities are intersecting with these issues of kind of nonstop changing technology. And so here we are today. So I'm going to go ahead and leave the floor to go. Yeah. We'll have lunch right next shortly.
Cool. Good afternoon. How are we going?
All right.
Good. Great day, right?
Yes.
I was eyeballing today, like 90 degrees, really. Thanks for the introduction, Steve, and just a couple quick shout outs. I worked with Ben Allen for a few different programs, and the first program was somebody recommended me to one of the colleagues who's no longer at Ben Allen, who stays in contact, and she wanted me to do a conversation during the lunchtime talk, like this one at Federal Hall, which used to be City Hall, at the exact same building with the same location. And some information that most people do not know about is this very long court case that took place in what was then City Hall in 1741. Just by a quick show of risk, anybody heard of that 5 to 6 month court case that happened in 1741? It's mildly obscure, but like you might bump into certain like historical geeks who are like, oh yes, that 5 to 6 month trial that turned into like the biggest judicial murder in world history that involved the rebellion between enslaved people and some poor Irish people. Fascinating stuff. And it's like, yeah, if we're gonna have a lunch conversation in this building, I have to talk about that. So she goes, yeah, that sounds cool. And that was how we began having discussions. And so I always appreciate that working with a group that might seem quite disparate from the stories that I tell, we find a lot of common ground in talking about the public space, the public square design. Was that a comment you wanted to make?
I'm just getting word that, even though we're a small group, we should use the mic for the video.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, I'm just so used to talking in here.
Yeah.
Check. Which is a great segue. Because we've been here for, it's like our 3rd or 4th week. How many weeks, Maven, we've been here? 4? Yeah, so this is a residency that we have through Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. They partner with Howard Hughes that manages the Seaport District. And the idea was to give us a space to give our walking tours, be in production for our graphic novel project, and also expand and do some programming around storytelling the way that we do it, which is like more, engaging as much as we possibly can. So it's inclusive, but also an experience, which led us to this idea of working with the Department of Transportation and Lower Manhattan Cultural Council to create these kiosks that are up right now. There's a series of them on Water Street and Gouverneur Lane, and right now they have they feature women doing work that isn't necessarily quote unquote feminine, to kind of show that women work in all types of different work spaces. Anybody seen those before on Gouverneur Lane and on Water Street? You did them. Say it again. Oh, cool. Yeah, it's a great piece. Looking forward to sharing. And so what we're doing is connecting what we're doing here in this space during the festival, as well as what we're doing with the kiosks on Gouverneur Lane and Water Street to create this ecosystem of ideas, in particular in a footprint that doesn't often talk about the past. You can walk on Wall Street now and there's like one plaque that talks about there was a slave market on Pearl and Wall Street. But the common lore that is spread that I've heard from people who worked on a project is that actual slave plaque should be one block over, but it was kind of like a little pushback on putting it where it actually belongs. Longer story? Okay. I love stories. So what we're doing is we're doing 2 different sets of kiosks that are double-sided, and I guess am I clicking or just touching? Look at that, we have technology. Am I pointing this way? Cool. Am I going the wrong way? Well, we'll get there. Give me a second. We can stop the clock on my 5 minutes. Pardon me for zooming past some brilliant photos. There we go. All right. And so here's an example of the way that we're engaging people to tell stories. One is by using humans to be actual characters, to be the folks whose stories we're telling. And so I love people who draw. I like to draw myself. I'm also a photographer. And I thought, what if we actually had people play these characters whose stories that have been forgotten? And so we have here on the cover of our graphic novel we're working on is a photo of a guy named Charles and a woman named Tan, but in the story they played Catalina and Domingo, who are the first landowners in the Netherlands, well, the New Netherlands here on this side of the ocean. And the concept is putting this story out in the public eye, so you kind of get a sense of who the characters are in a way that is common, like they're comic characters or superheroes, but you get some of the backstory and find out these were actual like landowners who were enslaved, that came across the ocean, perhaps going to Brazil, raided by pirates, brought here to help build up the actual island. And then this is another image here where we're using like all types of design elements, where the main thing we're using is like photography as the core element. So we photograph different things, whether it be like clouds or be it water, and then might incorporate some inking as well. And so this caption here talks about the Atlantic Ocean coming together on the hemisphere, 17th century, and there's some hands coming out of the water, and the idea is to show different ways of animating space. But imagine walking past this on your way to work or lunch. Would you maybe stop and take a look at it? We hope so. We hope that that's something that can grab your attention, but like get you to lean in a little bit. On Gouverneur Lane, we're doing a different approach. This is like a timeline. It goes from 1625 to 1765, and the first 2 just give context to where we are right now. So we begin with the year 2017 that talks about the project as a whole, and then on the back of this, it gives a little backstory or origin story in 2008 when I first got sparked to get this project, because I used to work someplace that some of you guys might have heard of before, the Tenement Museum on the Lower East Side. Anybody been there before? I worked there for about 4 years. I loved working there. I was like a little bit of a rebel when I was in high school, and I began to I'm gonna change my name from Samuel to Kamau, and I'm gonna organize a walkout for that Rodney King beating. And I was reading all types of books about Black history and culture, and I was into it from high school through college, and I still am. And when I came to New York, I began to hear more stories about immigrants coming to New York. I was like, wait a minute, white people have more stories that are interesting that common culture doesn't kind of put out there. It's kind of like, oh yeah, we're white and everything's perfect and we have money and sorry we enslaved you, get over it. And it's like people also came here and struggled, so I liked as a Black person to talk to people from all over the world about Irish, Jewish, Italian stories that have more layers to it than I think I was taught as an adult or as a child. But I had this very important moment in my life where I was talking to a youngster who was like 12, 13 years old, and I finished the story about this Italian family and a German Jewish family, and she was like, but where were the Black people at? And that just kind of made me think about my childhood and how I began to get more into books, and I still continue to do my research, but I felt in that moment somebody needed to make sure that the Black stories are being told. And that's why I created this project. And the other side of this particular panel, actually it's not, on this one, it gives more context for the backstory. And here's one of the slides. I don't know where I'm at in my 5-minute section. It might be at 4 minutes. This is the 1741 trial that I mentioned earlier, and most of you guys didn't quite raise your hand Like, we don't quite know about that. This is an awesome opportunity to put this history directly in front of people and begin to draw that line going back to 1625 and show how British New York, named after James Stuart, Duke of York, who before he became king, James II, he was the primary shareholder in the Royal African Trading Company, which was the biggest slave trading operation in the entire 18th century. And New York was actually created and taken from the Dutch to be the commercial hub of the transatlantic slave trade. Things most people don't know. And when you understand that and can appreciate that dynamic, you can understand why you might have rebellions before the American Revolution. And so part of what we're doing with this project is right here in the financial district is teasing out these unknown narratives that expand humanity, expand the story of America, and hopefully will make more conversations, because if anything, we want to make it not a didactic experience, but one where you kind of walk up to it and you see it and can use technology and social media to be a part of the conversation. So thank you guys for listening. I hope I didn't talk too fast. I was trying to give you guys a nice little nugget before I hit my 5-minute mark. I might have gone past it, who knows. Thank you guys.
Hi, I'm Jessica Lax. I lead our competitions work at Van Allen. Thank you. I think one of the reasons we really love the work of Black Gotham is that it really uncovers a lot of history that we might not, that is here and has been here for a long time, but isn't in our landscape. And so today is really about kiosks, and I think there's a great way to really talk about how there's opportunity to highlight a lot of this rich history through kiosks. And I'll talk a little bit about some of Van Allen's previous projects related to this, and sort of the different tools that kiosks can play within a city. I think a lot of people often just think about it as an information space or maybe a bathroom, but it's really a lot more than that. And so Van Allen did a competition back, I think, in 2004 called Civic Exchange, and it was really a reflection on 9/11 and thinking about how can we understand what the future of our city, or downtown rather, will look like after 9/11. So it was really something that was very forward-looking, which I think is sort of admirable in such a downer time in New York, to say, okay, what does this mean? Because it's not just about, are we going to rebuild, but what is it going to look like and how is that going to impact me? And so that was a competition we did back almost over 10 years ago now. But the design, oh, we don't have it here. But the design was basically like a bench, and it had a large technological component where you're sitting and getting to see the different opportunities that could happen within the downtown to better understand what that means for your community. We also do a lot of work with the Flatiron bid. So Van Allen's based in Flatiron. We like to do work within our own community, which means Flatiron. And outside, every year we do a different public plaza. And I know that thinking about plaza work isn't necessarily a kiosk, but I think there are a lot of things we can take away from that. And a big piece of that is really thinking about, well, one thing I love about this design is actually a bunch of little mirrors. When you think about the Flatiron area, obviously you think of the Flatiron building, and thinking about what is the culture and identity of that neighborhood. And this sculpture is really trying to sort of hone and highlight on the Flatiron building. A few others that we did for Flatiron was this one, which we did in 2015, which is sort of like a kaleidoscope. So when you look at it, again, it's sort of highlighting your surrounding area. And my personal favorite, just because I love hammocks, I went to the park a couple of weeks ago, brought my hammock out. The police came. They told me you can't do it, just so you know, but I did it anyway. And I'll continue to. But this was a really fun project where we had hammocks out there. And I think this really highlights another piece of what kiosks are about, which is creating community. And actually, kiosks were started, I looked up the whole history, and they actually started in the 13th century and were really tied to mosques as a way to look at landscapes. And so I think it's really interesting that this is situated right by a park, which really brings it back to its history. And slowly it transformed. Europeans took over the kiosk, and then it became sort of more of a commercial thing that we see it today, selling tickets or food or things like that. A project that we're working on right now with the Department of Transportation and Chinatown Partnership is called Gateways to Chinatown, which is a little bit more obviously a kiosk. And this is what's currently located there. It's at the Canal Triangle. And it's your traditional kiosk, but there's also 5 ginkgo trees. And again, I think it's interesting that it brings back this history of parks and kiosks and their connection to each other. But what we're really looking to do with this Gateways to Chinatown competition is think about how can we create a gateway that reflects, becomes an icon to the community, but also is a wayfinding opportunity, both for people who are currently there, but people who are visiting. So obviously, Chinatown is always, there's so many people there, and I feel like whenever you're walking around, it's very easy to get lost or confused, or, you know, I think when you think about a kiosk or a gateway, it's hard to remember that you're both entering somewhere and you're also leaving somewhere, which means you're entering somewhere else. And so this project, while thinking about Gateway to Chinatown, is also thinking about how can we identify with the neighboring community, which is Little Italy, and thinking about how the two connect. And for all of these projects, super important to Van Allen and of course our friends, the DOT and Chinatown Partnership, is community engagement. So how do we decide what this structure should look like? So we did a community engagement project back in August, asking people what they wanted to see, and actually what they did want to see was wayfinding, which I think is really interesting. They also wanted to see a lot of technology, but I think what's really exciting about this is that not only did we do a workshop with the community, but the DOT also spread out ambassadors to really survey people about what they wanted and what we're interested in, and we were able to incorporate that into our RFP and say, hey, this is what the community wants. So excitingly, this is open now and wraps up in a month and a day. And this is one more project we currently have open called Opportunity Space. It's in Malmo, Sweden. It's our first international project. And this isn't inherently a kiosk, but it definitely has some of those kiosk qualities. And to tell you a little bit about it, it's a design competition to do a temporary structure in a park that I will never learn how to pronounce. And what we're doing is a 2-week festival around cultural exchange and job training. And so I don't know if you guys know, but Malmo is basically the entryway for refugees to Scandinavia. At its peak, there was about 10,000 refugees coming into Malmo a week, which is pretty crazy. That was in 2015. And so this is looking to address that. And I think it's really interesting to think of kiosks as a way to not just engage community and bring people out to hang out like we sort of did with the hammocks, but also as a way to do programming and a cause exchange. And so that's what I really love about this project in particular. Yeah, I think I talked really quickly. I'm sorry, guys. But yeah.
Hey, everybody. My name is Paul McConnell. I head up design at Intersection. Thanks for coming down. Actually, funny enough, I used to work in high school and college at the Seaport Museum on the Peking, which I think might be under construction. So it's great to be back down here because I think at the time I would spend most of my days talking about design in cities and not really working. So I'm actually continuing that and talking about design in cities now. So ironically, I'm here. So one of the things that we do is try to understand how people are using technology and how they can make spaces in cities a little bit better. So a lot of the projects we're talking about are more on that kind of like, I'm representing the design and technology side of the house, but I think you can start to see where what I'm trying to get at is when you start to kind of work with storytellers and artists like Kamal, or if you talk civic thinkers like Jess, like what great things we can do when we start coming together with these things. So, so I think when a lot of people think about cities, technologists, engineers, urban planners, they kind of like look at it from the top down. They look at buildings, they look at infrastructure, they look at streets. And designers inherently like to look at it from this perspective. I think naturally we come to cities because of people, because we're attracted to ideas, to opportunity, to different cultures. And I think it's something that's really important. I think from my perspective and a lot of stuff that we've been talking about earlier today, even before the session, even my family's history, my father, he's Irish, but he came here in 1971, not 1741. But it was, even coming in the 70s from a country that was going through a rough bit of history, like New York, even in its bombed out 70s, is still a glorious place that you can't even talk bad about to him, because he was able to have an opportunity to build a family, to kind of grow a career. So I think that's something that we think about, how can technology help enable that, kind of get people to feel safe, feel more comfortable, and kind of be a part of this economic engine or this cultural engine that's in the city. So it's a lot of stuff that I like to think about. But I think when you think about technology in cities, you think about things like this. You think about fire call boxes. You think about ATMs. It's kind of scary. So we really don't have a precedent for interacting with the city. It's kind of like if you called 311 years ago, they've been better about it recently, but it's like you almost felt like you were complaining, not contributing to making a city better. So there really isn't a lot of precedent around kind of changing this behavior. So this is something we like to think about. So, cities used to basically be static, so transit information, it was just, you just went and hoped things worked. And then we got smartphones and the internet, and we were able to kind of learn more about our communities, each other, and move around our cities. And now what you're seeing with like the devices we have in our pockets and kind of sensors all around us is that these spaces are learning from us. They're basically learning from us maybe in some ways that we don't even know about, and they're all kind of like working together hopefully to make our experience a little bit better. So essentially what we do, kind of it's a term called experience design. I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's essentially the study of people in their context in order to design new tools that hopefully help them achieve their goals. So that's a lot of our work. We try to, again, a lot of these similar principles, going out, learning from people, and then ultimately coming up with ideas and products, like I'll get to in a second. And ultimately, it's hard to see this graphic from here, what I think kind of technology designers try to do is make machines less scary. And maybe if you make them less scary, you can tell better stories. So if you think about kind of command line interfaces in the late 1970s, like you had to be a kind of an expert programmer to interface with the machine. And then the Mac and graphical user interfaces came along. You had easy to use icons and the mouse, and the machine became a little less scary. Email is a great example of like communicating, and that was basically an interface with other people to this machine. And smartphones, a huge wave, or I don't know about you guys, but a lot of my people in my family like finally understood the internet with the smartphone because an iPhone is just really easy to use. I press a button, I can email someone, I can call someone, I can kind of get my local information. And now we're starting to see kind of connected devices, voice interfaces like the Amazon Echo, kind of having, again, another, less of a barrier. So even an example like that, recently at Thanksgiving, my 5-year-old daughter basically went up to our Amazon Echo and said, "Can you play this song, maybe a song from Moana?" And the song came on. And my grandmother was kind of like struck. She was saying, what was that? What just happened? I says, well, if you just ask it to play any song ever, it'll play this song for you. And so she did. And she finally, after 25 years of resisting the internet, resisting mobile technology, got the internet. Like that is the internet. It should be that simple because you've removed all of these barriers. And so, so I think there's another way when we talk about capturing people's stories. How do you make it easier to interact with the city to capture people's stories, and what else can you do from there? So a lot of our work, we involve, you can't see this, but these are a lot of shots of us in the street talking to people, a lot of stuff we kind of listening and learning. From there we make prototypes, and those might be quick rough sketches, or it might be more functional technology, and then we stand those up into spaces. This is a project we worked on, we partnered with some people on a few years ago called Talking Transitions in New York City. It was on Canal Street, and it was during the transition to the de Blasio mayoral administration. So during the day we had street teams running all over New York City, kind of polling people with different devices, and that night thought leaders from the community would kind of respond to these questions. So you'd have these kind of like daily real-time feedback structures in this pop-up space. This is an example of a museum project that we've done in Boston, Kennedy Institute, and this is basically where students can come in, each they get a tablet and they're assigned a role. So you might be a Democrat from Arkansas, you might be a Republican from Illinois, and depending on the game of the day, and that might be tort reform or gun legislation, you have to figure out how to kind of pass this bill. Something that I think people joked about, that a lot of people in the actual Senate should go to this simulation and figure out how to do that. And then most recently, a lot of our work, we do a lot of work with transit spaces. So this is a little bit different from kind of the cultural side, but it's moving people through spaces faster. So how can I get information? How can I move through? And ultimately a project that I'll talk a little bit about, which is Link NYC. I don't know how many people have seen this on the streets at all. So this is a project, an RFP that was put out by the Bloomberg administration to try to rethink its aging payphone infrastructure. And essentially we were part of a group of partners that bid on it and essentially won the project. to start replacing that. So pretty big project over the last few years. For those of you who don't know, the big push and the reason the city wanted to do this was they were making a significant amount of money off of payphones, and it's not like quarters. It was actually because of the advertising on that. So that was a reason that even though my daughter, when she walks by a payphone, she's like, why is there a calculator on the street? And like not knowing what this thing is. They were there for decades, even though we had our own devices and people stopped using them. They were making a lot of money from advertising. But they also said that there was a major connectivity gap for the constituents of New York City. So basically at the time, I think it was about 40% of people in New York didn't have access to connectivity. So if you're trying to get out of your situation or do homework or get a job and you're getting kicked out of a McDonald's or a Starbucks because you don't have Wi-Fi, it's a pretty big barrier. So it was a big cause by the city to say, is connectivity the kind of clean drinking water of our day? Should it be a right? So since then, we've been working to try to build this out. Let me know how I'm doing on time, Stephen. Okay, I'll kind of be quick about it, but if you don't know, it's free gigabit Wi-Fi, phone calls, charging, maps, access to city services. And this kind of freaks you out as a designer, like after yay, we won the project, and now you have to design for a city. It's just kind of that like it paralyzes you. So one of the things that we wanted to do was trying to design for everyone, inclusive design. And essentially the way we try to do that in a lot of our cases, and this is just maybe a quick example, is we try to think of the extremes. So people that are highly connected to not connected, to technical literacy, native English speakers and non-English speakers. And typically if you see that blue line around there, if we find groups of people that represent those extremes and we start talking to them and creating prototypes and learning from them, you typically solve for the center. So it's kind of a way that we you can kind of break down a pretty large problem set. So this might be groups, OATS is Older Adults in Technology group. We spend a lot of time with Silicon Harlem, Red Hook Initiative. So just kind of, if you kind of spend a lot of time talking to people all over the city, you can start to learn a lot of things. So I'll skip through a lot of these, but you just hear kind of really interesting stories about how people are using technology, what their kind of fears are, what their concerns are, and then just maybe how much of a benefit this can have. So over time, we kind of scaled this, built it up, continued to design it, install it. Now we're at about close to 800, going up to 8,000, and trying to experiment with new things. So you might not think 8,000 is a lot, but over the course of the city, that's actually free Wi-Fi. And if you think about how high our cell phone bills are every month, it's pretty significant to maybe a small family that can't afford it. So we realize that people change, that cities change, technology changes. So a lot of what this is kind of, it's hardware in a city that should change, that we should learn from communities. We're not done. I'm on a team of people that do nothing but think about how we can make these things better. How can we tie these to communities? How can we make them better for people? How can we talk to artists? How can we tell different stories? This was a campaign we did around registering to vote. We had some, I'll give you an example. Last year, before I wrap, Stephen, is last year it turned out there were a lot of people that were housing or economically challenged coming out to these kiosks. They were spending a lot of time there. And there was a kind of a dust-up about this. But in many ways, this was around connectivity inequality. People wanted access to these services, and if you never had an internet or a home or a phone, and now you have these, it's kind of like, wow, I want to spend a lot of time with it. So I think some things that we try to preach and practice is how can we be resilient and recognize, guess what, there is a housing challenged population in New York City. We can just ignore it and shut these things down, or we can say, what can we use with something like Link to maybe try to help that situation. So we actually launched a project with a nonprofit in the city called Aunt Bertha, and essentially Aunt Bertha kind of pulls together local pantries, shelters, any city services. So if someone is at this kiosk, they can say, what's the closest place that I can eat or get shelter right where I am, because I know your location, it's right here. So if you go back to my slide earlier, and we're trying to cut down the friction with engaging with the city, I don't know if you guys have to kind of like apply to schools for your kids or get some sort of kind of, a lot of artists here, grant money. There are a lot of steps to engaging and interacting with the city. So maybe something like Link or other technologies can kind of cut down those barriers where if people just want to make it a little bit easier to get access to city services. So that's a lot of the stuff that we're doing now, thinking about social services, how do we connect more with small businesses, how do we do more of community engagement work, making things a little bit more appropriate. Recently we're going to be expanding to the UK, so I think that's another challenge. How do you start to understand a culture that's not ours, and kind of be sensitive and learn along the way and go from there. So sorry if I ran over, but I could talk for about Thank you.
Great, thanks. So if everyone wants to grab some lunch, and then we're going to change this into more of a roundtable circular discussion for the rest of the time. So I think to begin, everyone talked about engagement in different ways, and at Finale we talk a lot about innovating engagement and what that can look like. And so does each person maybe want to talk about how they think like engagement can be improved, or how you define it currently?
On a housekeeping note, can I just quickly introduce my man Will Ellis over here? This brother over here, he works with, he's on my design team, DJ, UX designer. So the panels you see over there in the front, he designed those. I gave him the assets and photography. And the kiosks we're doing on Water Street, he designed those too. So I want to make sure we knew why he's sitting there looking all smart. Thank you. Am I answering the question now?
Yeah.
What was the question?
How can engagement be improved, or how do you define it?
I think engagement starts with people being like honest and unafraid. I think that right now, like being offended is like so sexy that you look smart if you're mad at something. You know what I mean? Like, well, like people like want to correct you all the time. Like everybody has like the biggest nerve cells in the world, and so I think sometimes it makes people afraid to like be themselves. And like someone asked me that about authenticity, and like, so some of your characters, you know, they might not quite look exactly like black people did in 1650. Are you worried about that? I was like, hell no. You know, like in 200 years from now, they're going to want to know how we look right now. You know, I think that people need to stop worrying, you know, be respectful. But I think part of having like authentic, you know, interactions is people, you know, being like a little bit more human and relaxed and like not so worried. I think that the tension, if they, you know, bring down the tension a bit, I think we'll do like a lot better with that.
Yeah, I love that point. I think it's spot on. I think so many times I'm in workshops and someone's afraid to ask a question just to, you know, get clarification because they're afraid it might offend somebody. And that's creating more challenges, right, if we can't even talk about what you don't know about. But you know what you don't know, which is the first barrier, right? Sometimes you don't even know what you don't know. But they know what they don't know, and now they can't even ask the question. But I think the other thing is, I mean, aside from, I think the word authenticity stood out to me because something that came out with the Chinatown Gateways workshop, people wanted an authentic gateway. And what does that mean? And how does that change over time? And I think that's a really big piece with the workshops and community engagement is communities change over time. And how do you capture that too with your engagement? And how can you enable flexibility?
I would take it in a slightly different direction. I think you have to understand that like maybe community engagements, just the idea of it's changed drastically. So we went from kind of a city of neighborhoods where you had like really close associations with people taking care of their block, taking care of their park, you know, assorted groups. And now those, less and less do you see those around New York. You could probably name a handful of communities that you would call that idea. But you'll have people within those neighborhoods that might have these digital communities or these other social networks. I think we need to think of like how do you engage people in a way that they want to be engaged with. Other people might just they're busy. There's a busy city. They have lives. So it's, you know, like is there a small way that I can be engaged, that I can contribute without feeling a pressure? I think everyone here is probably on the other side of the spectrum where we're taking up our lunchtime, we're coming across town to something like this, like we're probably the people that are involved with these groups, but like we need those small kind of like Kickstarter level like contributions from the masses to really get a big momentum. So I think maybe I would think of engagement in multiple ways, like physical, but then these kind of like maybe kind of spread out engagement pieces that together could actually do something pretty impressive. Does anybody else want to share thoughts on engagement? Pass the mic.
So thanks both for sharing about the kiosks that you guys are developing. And I was thinking of, in your presentation, but also in yours, about how there may be an opportunity not just to provide information provision, and instead use these tools as a way of gathering information. And so you spoke a little bit about the vote across the city effort, the sort of citywide get people engaged. But I almost look at these terminals and I think, like, what if you could actually post projects that are happening in the neighborhood? Like, you could do your participatory budgeting. You could post information about, you know, your history in the neighborhood. You could, I don't know. I just think there's opportunities for sort of community wide sort of, rather than a city-wide effort, but really looking at different community boards, how could you actually break that and use that tool for information gathering? So I wonder if you guys have thought about that a little bit.
Yes, we've thought about that quite a bit. I think you're exactly right. That's exactly where we want this to go. With large projects like this, I think the first 2 years is can this thing stand up? Is it stable? Is it going to melt on a 90-degree day? Is it going to freeze in the winter? So I think that's kind of like the core effort. And I think right now we're at that point where we have kind of like a list of all the things that we want to prototype and test out and see if they solve a problem for people. You're exactly right. I think there's the vision where I should be able to walk my dog down the street and they say, hey, there's a vote tonight at your community board. Should we fix that pothole or should we fix, paint the graffiti over there? And I can kind of snap vote it in a way. And the next day, maybe it's somehow giving me information about more transparency in my community board, which unless you go to a meeting, you really don't know anything about, and most people don't even know what a community board is. So I think these are great ideas that we're trying to get out there as we grow and as we scale, because I think a major goal that we have is engaging with the community and trying to rethink what technology can mean for the community in a way. And so I think these are ideas that with storytellers, with civic thinkers, that these are things that we have these boxes in the street. You don't maybe necessarily even have to engage with them directly. Maybe we're learning things about behaviors in the city. So if, Will, you're going to open up a small business at some point, maybe we can provide you with information to say, hey, a lot of pedestrians actually go down the street. This is a good mix, this and that. So what kind of data can we gather from these things? Not just kind of the explicit screens in a way. So yeah, keep the ideas coming. I'll give you my cards. We like really good ideas, and I think we just need ideas and people to help us make them and get them together. Yep.
And really great feedback. But this is something I also want to stress, just from a principal standpoint, in terms of design and just thinking about how we can implement things like this. I have 20 years working in the agency world, and designing all kind of different projects for different things, and you'd be surprised how many people, when they're designing things for people, never interact with the people themselves. And so I think something that's very critical is that when you're designing something for a community is to get very intimate and close to that community and understand who these people are, what makes them tick, what makes them think, what motivates them, and then design to that. Because a lot of times what happens is, we have like kind of conference room design sessions where we're in this room somewhere in Soho or in Midtown and we're designing this thing for these people, and the only contact we have with these people is some report or some data or something that we Googled or researched. And so I think it's very critical that when you're designing for the community to understand what who that community is and make something that's very useful for them and not just useful for what you think it should be for. So yeah.
I asked you this question during the break, but I think it's interesting to think that you're doing this storytelling on the art display cases. And what it made me think about is there a way that you could make that, it's almost like that's static, you're digital, but could you make that not digital, but make it come alive and maybe have a talk back there on the street to bring attention to what's static? So that might be interesting, or maybe even sort of act out something. You know what I mean? Like have these actors come alive or something like that. But it may be interesting because that's what people are responding to so much. But we talked about maybe you can respond to that of the balance, if there's a balance between digital and static, because we have the wayfinding that's static, and as I said, we sort of defend that, not in a defensive way, but what's the balance that we would have between what's moving and what's static and the benefits of that?
Sure. Maybe Kamal, you want to take the cultural, the storytelling?
Yeah, I think I like both of these questions. I think that they're, I kind of want to put them side by side and talk to both of them for a second, because I think that they relate. As far as a static kiosk and how can it come to life and how can it collect information, that's something that we're literally like in the process of trying to figure out how we add a layer to the static experience. One thing we did consider was like the actual way that we want to cover like the entire kiosk versus right now, if you guys walk by the kiosk now, there's like still like some like space around it. And me, Will, and an architect, we actually met at a Van Allen, I think the festival we had in November, who she's like following us through Instagram. Then she like, we met up somewhere else and she wanted to hang out and talk about it. And we like, if we can get everything to kind of go to the bleed of the actual kiosk, then one thing that'll happen is it'll move a bit. Like the way you perceive it, if it goes to the edge of the kiosk, it actually gives you like different types of points of interest based on how you move about it. And then the next layer on top of that is how do we use augmented reality so people can actually get some other content and go a little bit layer deeper. And I think that's something that is interesting to consider, how maybe where that augmented reality experience takes you to, because it's all internet based. Is there an opportunity there to like, it can be like a survey or a question or a way to ask people to share what they know, or even kind of capture somebody's, you know, recording in that moment, and then maybe possibly have some portal where we can like, you know, feed that back. So I think that's something that's great for us to consider. So my answer to your question is, that's a great thing to consider versus me actually giving you an answer, but using augmented reality as a way for people to, you know, trigger how they respond to the kiosk versus it being like a one-way thing. So yeah, thanks for that set of questions.
Wendy, I try to address the second part. I think, and this was around how does wayfinding in cities, the playoff between digital and static kind of change? And I think we haven't really figured out the answer of how, what even environmental signage or graphics are in cities and how it's become, because our behaviors around technology has changed so much in the last 10 years. So it took thousands of years for us to kind of figure out like the right form for street signs and the right kind of quote unquote programming of the street, line of sight, all of that good stuff. And so, you know, it's why highway signs were placed a certain way, stop signs were placed a certain way, et cetera. And now we're looking down at our devices and like, what does that mean? Like there was a study in the 70s, a guy named William White kind of studied pedestrian flows in cities, and you guys know this, but he would kind of compare it to schools of fish, and it was like this hive mind where if someone even fell, the hive would swim around it, and like it was like this, you know, it's a kind of like Grand Central Station, and it's a perfect moment where everyone's kind of crossing. Now that half the room is looking down at their devices, you start seeing that like subtle bump, you start seeing that thing, you start seeing someone miss a sign in a way. So I think we have to figure out what is that right balance between information that they're not getting down from a screen that they need to get from the space, things in a space that might need to respond better. So I'll give you an example. You're you know, going down 5 levels into a subway station, and then you get there and you find out your train doesn't run. And you're like, well, you could have told me on that sign that doesn't do anything up there. So I think we're kind of expecting faster feedback in different ways, but I think we're in this moment and trying to figure out what is the balance between digital and static. But we're also everyone here demands more accurate, relevant, local information of any age. Like we expect it. So I think you're going to start seeing more and more of that.
I think one other thing that I know Van Allen's really interested in that we're trying to incorporate more is how technology can inform better designs and moving forward. So for example, where I showed a few Flatiron bid plazas, and what we're doing now is thinking about how can we put sensors in them to see how they're impacting people or how people are interacting with them, how long they're interacting with them, to better inform future design. So I don't think it's just about us giving information out, but it's also us collecting information to improve future iterations.
I just have a question. I mean, talking about this, and we've been talking about this for a while with the Gateways to Chinatown project. And 2 years ago, when we tried to test this at Division Street, the whole idea, and it was manual. It was people posting information and people getting the information back. But I guess the question I have is just who, in the end, is curating and controlling the information? I mean, I'm inspired by what you were talking about stories untold in in the physical environment. I think that's significant, and we need to make space for those. But I guess on the flip side, I'm thinking of an 80s movie with Melanie Griffith, where she, I don't know if you've seen it, where she, there's the ticker tape and Wall Street, and she was really abused by one of her bosses, and she types in some expletives. I mean, that's not true. Yes, working girl. Which is, to me, the ultimate of like using digitized information in a public or quasi-public space for. But so who curates it? I'm myself am obsessed now with like BBC, World News, everything like constantly bombarding me with information, and I trust these sources, but how do we trust them? Are they reflective of the community? Like in Chinatown, who is posting that? I mean, and then there's a practical thing with, I think the Chinatown Partnership had to actually manage those messages. They weren't objectionable in the end, but I guess that's an open question. And what voice is being, how egalitarian?
Yeah, it makes me immediately think of a project Van Allen did over the summer called Memorials for the Future, and it was about, a lot of our existing memorial landscape is obviously stoic. It doesn't really show how we might have uncovered new information about someone might be racist. How do we demonstrate that they're not all this wonderful person that this statue is trying to reflect? And we had 4 different teams, but one of the proposals was a flock of pink parrots. They were sort of like drones, if you can imagine them, that people could record their story about their interaction or their knowledge around that monument, and then it would tell that story to other people in the area. And that was a huge thing that came up again and again. How are you going to curate it? Whose stories do you get to tell? And I think in their proposal they were saying everyone's story, right? But honestly, you need like a huge group of people to curate something like that. And if I were to say who would do it, my best guess would be like a journalist or something like that. And you can think about the types of people who share our stories. But there's no one really qualified to, right? Everyone has their biases or wants to share a certain type of story. It's really challenging to, and you'll never do it. There's too many people. But that's my, pessimistic view.
Yeah, I think it definitely depends on the device and the context, because I think a lot of people are really big on being self-curators. And everybody used to not quite know what a curator was. I feel like 15 years ago, and now everyone's a curator now, because it's sexy and cute to be I make decisions, I choose, I have taste. And that's great, And I think people are leaning into that in a way where they are enjoying rejecting certain things. That doesn't quite work for me. And so there might be a limiting aspect to having a static kiosk, but at the same time, I like having the dimensions of 2, where you can have that static experience versus have it change, because in that particular moment, no matter who is experiencing those kiosks, it's we're all kind of on the same channel, versus it being something different based on what you want to program it to be or what you want that experience to be. It's kind of still having books versus having a Kindle that can have 18,000 books or 1,800, I don't know. Depends on the size of your Kindle. But yeah, I think that there's something still about that's almost like an analog experience where people get a chance to agree on something that's common that they all want to sit there and consume. But like I said, the context really determines if that makes sense or not. But I do think that one thing to always make sure you have in the front of mind is that people want to be able to choose more and more what they take in, and if somebody else is curating that for them, sometimes that might de-incentivize them to want to lean into it.
Just to build on that, I think it's really the channel. So it's something like Link. It isn't appropriate for real-time community feedback without filtration, and it's just not appropriate in the public sector. But who knows, maybe that's a way to capture information, and those real pure thoughts are shared where I could look at it on my device or at home or something like that. But I think the idea of people putting out content has proven to be successful. It's the biggest corpus of knowledge in mankind is Wikipedia, that's governed by people and edited by people, and it's probably more trusted than most, many scientific journals. So that's been done. But essentially, I think putting something like that out there is also pretty interesting. We've all seen comments and kind of flame wars on a site, but it's interesting, and it's what people feel. And like it or not, cities have by people with some real raw, interesting thoughts. So it's probably better to acknowledge them and listen and ignore them and maybe try to understand their perspective, even if they're different and they're angry or they're, offensive, because it might get to something really kind of more interesting.
All right. It sounds like people are ready to be pushed around a little bit more. Okay, so I know that. So this was supposed to be a 1-hour event, and we've gone a little bit over, and I know people have work. But thank you so much to Kamau and Jess and to Paul and everyone for giving up their lunch to learn. And we have a lot more food if you want to take some.
Thank you.